Hey guys, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. In today's video, we're going to be talking about one of the most frequently asked questions for AP Lang, and that is, what exactly is a rhetorical choice? So how do you distinguish a rhetorical device from a rhetorical choice? And more importantly, how do you actually write about it? The difference between a rhetorical device and a rhetorical choice is that a device is going to be a noun. It's something that the writer uses, whereas a choice is going to be a verb. It's something that the writer is doing. In some cases, it's going to be rather easy to take a rhetorical device in the noun form and turn it into a rhetorical choice in the verb form. So a couple examples might be an allusion. So instead of saying the writer uses an allusion, you could say the writer alludes to, and then you'd want to actually say what that allusion is. Or another example might be juxtaposition. So instead of saying the writer uses juxtaposition, you could say the writer juxtaposes this and this, or the writer contrasts this and this. So those are ones where you could take the noun form and turn it into a verb pretty easily. However, that's not always the case. One example of something that doesn't translate really easily is an anecdote. So let's say that you recognize that the writer is using an anecdote. That's a device. So how do you turn that into a choice? Well, you want to ask yourself, okay, what is he or she doing? And since there isn't really a verb that goes with anecdote, you might need a phrase. So you could say that he or she reminisces on a time when, or he or she recalls a time when, or even he or she tells a story about. Now, that might not be as sophisticated as the other options, but it is better to use a verb instead of a noun. So that would just be one example. So now that you have a basic understanding of the difference between a rhetorical device and a rhetorical choice, let's talk about how to actually incorporate these into an essay. So you want to try to use rhetorically accurate verbs. That means stronger verbs. And so I've got two examples here. The top example is using the noun form of these particular words. So it's going to be a device-driven thesis. And the bottom example is taking the same exact idea, but replacing those nouns with verbs. So I want to make one thing clear. I know a lot of students write device-driven thesis statements, and technically speaking, based on what we know from the College Board's grading and their rubric, these are still defensible. So I even had a few of my top students on the 2020 AP Lang exam write a device-driven thesis, and they hadn't done it all year in class, but under pressure, that was the best they can do. And they still wrote a great essay. So if you are the type of person who is struggling with this, I want you to practice it. Sentence frames can be really helpful, but at the same time, I don't want you to stress out about this too much because it does take practice. So identify those nouns in your thesis statement and ask yourself, how can I turn this into a stronger verb? If you want to take a second to pause the video so you can actually read these thesis statements, go ahead and do so now. And if you want to see more information about this, definitely check out my other videos about thesis statements and sentence frames. So as you're practicing writing the verb form in your thesis statement, that way you're conveying a rhetorical choice, you also want to practice that same skill in your body paragraphs. And so one of the most common ways that I see students using the device form as opposed to the choice form is in their topic sentences. So a lot of times when students are learning how to write a rhetorical analysis essay, they might write a sentence like this: one choice President Roosevelt makes is repetition. And that is a very simple sentence, but we can actually spruce it up and use a stronger verb really easily. So I gave you guys two examples here, and this is conveying the same idea, but it's much more detailed. Oftentimes when you change your sentence structure to focus on that stronger verb, it forces you to add in more information and it makes for a better sentence. So go ahead and pause the screen now, that way you could read those two bottom examples. Something else that you can do in order to strengthen your writing is to have a rhetorically accurate verbs list. So I made one here with some of the verbs that I think students can use most frequently in rhetorical analysis, but there are other lists out there that are much more detailed. Sometimes I think a detailed list like that can be really overwhelming, so I try to give my students a shorter list, and I also encourage them not to use simpler verbs like says, shows, and uses, because those are very imprecise. So instead, we want to focus on these stronger verbs. So we've been talking about rhetorical devices and rhetorical choices, but what about rhetorical appeals? One of the reasons why I have adopted the acronym SPACE-CAT as opposed to SOAPSTONE is because it separates choices and appeals. So SPACE-CAT is an acronym that you could use when writing a rhetorical analysis essay, and I like that choices and appeals are separate because I think it helps students recognize that choices create appeals. So a couple years ago, I noticed that that my emerging writers were very adept at recognizing logos, ethos, and pathos. However, once they found a rhetorical appeal, it was a lot harder for them to figure out what the choice was, and they were much more tempted to write about that appeal, and it led to a weaker essay. So one of the things that I encourage my students to do now is if they find an appeal, let's say they notice that there's an appeal to logos, I encourage them to ask themselves, what makes this logical? Which choice is the writer making in order to create this logical appeal? And when they think of it that way, they're able to identify the actual choice that the writer is making. So it could be facts or statistics, it could be conditional sentences, it could be a logical example. And so it's important to actually ask yourself, which choice is the writer making in order to create this appeal, and why is the writer making this choice? So you might have noticed that on this slide, it says Coach Hall's levels, and it says uses logos, appeals to logic, logically asserts. Now, that might look a little strange, so let me explain what that is. It is not anything official from the College Board, but it is something that I use in my own classroom. So I tell my students that when they're writing essays, I don't want to see the phrase uses logos. So instead, I would accept appeals to logic or appeals to reason, because that's at least a little bit stronger. And as they become more comfortable with that, then we try to work in phrases like logically asserts. So it implies logos without actually using the word logos, because it sounds better to use appeals to logic or logically asserts. So I actually did another video on this right before the AP Lang exam. I'm pretty sure I uploaded it like the day of the exam. So if you're curious about how to avoid this phrasing, definitely go check out that video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, please do me a huge favor and give the video a thumbs up. That lets other teachers and students know that they might enjoy it as well. And also make sure that you are subscribed with your notifications turned on. That way you don't miss any other AP Lang FAQ videos. Until next time, guys, happy writing!